And so the plagues begin, and the illusions start getting peeled back one by one. The idols start getting shattered one by one, right? The Nile turns to blood. And why did the first plague emanate from the Nile? Well, the Nile was their god. It was like the source of their fertility. They worshiped the Nile. They placed their faith in the Nile. They didn't need God. They had everything that they needed, or so they thought, right? And then this great god of theirs, this great and mighty Nile, turned to blood, right? It was like the Nile itself was slain, like it was killed. And this is not only shattered their belief in the Nile, but it started chipping away at their belief in Pharaoh himself. But then, just in case that anyone thought perhaps this was a plague of the god of the Nile and that he only had power in the Nile, well, then came the frogs. And what are frogs? They're amphibians, which start in water, but then venture out of the water and cover the face of Egypt in every room, in every home, in their ovens and in their furnaces. And it became clear that this deity has control and autonomy, not only over the Nile, but over land itself as well. And this is how it kept going, right? Just plague by plague, the falsehoods of the Egyptian worldview were becoming exposed, shattering these belief systems, bringing down the haughty, just humbling the arrogant. And it was a process, right? Because anything real tends to be a process. There was a reason that the Jews needed to travel 40 years through the desert, because human nature takes time to integrate and internalize these new realities. This one cataclysmic plague, it was not enough to have one plague. It needed to be done step by step. And I always wondered how the general population of Egypt responded, because we don't really hear that much about it. Were they like as obstinate and stubborn as Pharaoh? Were they like, why doesn't Pharaoh just back down? Was there disagreement among them about how the nation should progress? I don't know, but we don't hear that much about them. But who do we hear about? We hear about Pharaoh himself, about his reaction, about the process that he went through. Now, I'll tell you, it seems like a shame that friends of mine that I went to grade school with look at the Torah and they say, I know it. I read it in school. I went to a Jewish day school. I know the stories. Because they know these stories through the eyes of a first grader on the most simple and remedial level. But being that the Torah is not a book, but a living teaching, as we change and we evolve in our journey through this world, the Torah speaks to us in completely new ways and imparts these radically new wisdoms and truths that we need exactly when we encounter it. So I've noticed that as I'm experiencing the Torah in my adult life, the characters cease being black and white, right? They stop being good and bad. They develop this complexity to them. And I start seeing myself in those other characters as well. Alarmingly, I find myself empathizing with the pain, for example, of Esav upon finding out that he traded his birthright for a bowl of soup. For who of us have not betrayed Hashem in some way for a fleeting moment of a forbidden pleasure, right? Trading in true closeness to God, which is the greatest joy and pleasure imaginable. We trade that in for illusions and stupidity, right? Seeing this conflict within him of hating his brother Jacob, but loving him at the same time, it was just very real and very human. Well, it's the same with Pharaoh. There's real room for empathy and compassion for Pharaoh. I know maybe that's a contentious, controversial thing to say. It doesn't mean that he was anything other than profoundly evil, right? It doesn't mean that he didn't deserve every single thing that he got, but it still means that we can empathize with him, or at least I feel like I can. Okay, I'll speak for myself. I couldn't help feeling it as I'm going through the Torah portion. And I intentionally did not say sympathize, because when you sympathize with someone, you feel compassion for what they're going through. You feel bad for them. But empathy means that you can actually see yourself in them. And I think that if we all dig deep into our hearts, we'll see that we all indeed may have a little bit of Pharaoh in us. Perhaps we have more than we'd like to admit. And by the way, I believe that the mystics tell us the very same thing. I should really have called Jeremy and asked him because I couldn't find the source. But I believe they tell us that there is a spark of each character from the Torah within us, that it's all within us. Now, these ideas I'm about to share you were very much inspired by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. May his memory be a blessing. And he was just such a giant, and he's so missed from the world. I feel like we're just increasingly an orphaned generation. Anyways, so let's think about Pharaoh for a moment. He was born as the son of Pharaoh, the Pharaoh before him, and he was raised being taught that he was a god whose brothers were the sun and the moon and the Nile. And that's why he had to say no to Moshe in Moshe's request that the nation of Israel go to worship God in the desert, because number one, he's God. So how could he let them leave and worship another God when he himself is the most powerful God? And number two, letting them go would be a tacit recognition that the people of Israel have a certain degree of independence. And that is not a joke for Pharaoh politically, or any leader politically, right? That is exactly what could lead to untold numbers of rebellions and revolutions. We see even today that I think the next world war could very much be sparked by exactly that same scenario, right? Whether it's Taiwan seeking independence from China or Ukraine from Russia. Will the world get involved? Will America get involved? Will it spark a global war? But it's all coming from that same root. So there's no such thing as an isolated situation. Everything can be a precedent. So of course, Pharaoh had to say no. For in his mind, he was God, and Egypt was this uncontested superpower of the planet. That's what it always will be and always has been, and that's just what is. And you really can't blame him for it, right? It wasn't only what his family told him, but the rest of the world really seemed to affirm this truth. So now, we may not have been raised believing that we were literally God, but I think that sometimes the Torah gives us this extreme example of certain attributes to help us understand underlying truths about ourselves that are true. To a lesser degree, obviously, but they're true. It's just that we need to see it in the most extreme manifestation to understand this truth about ourselves. And so, who is the Pharaoh within us? The Pharaoh within us is the voice that knows the way things are supposed to be, right? The Pharaoh within us is the one that's sometimes furious, that's righteously indignant at the way things have turned out in some aspect of our lives. Things were not supposed to turn out this way. Why? Because we know, right? The Pharaoh within me is that voice that just stubbornly refuses to accept the fact that we don't know, that refuses to accept the truth that Hashem runs the world and not us. So Rabbi Steinsaltz points out this very powerful truth. He explains that while Pharaoh does seem to yield in certain ways throughout the initial plagues, after which he backtracks and rescinds his decrees and says they could leave and no, they can't leave, and the whole thing, we know the story. But there seems to have been a much more fundamental and profound shift within him after the sixth plague, the plague of hail. So as opposed to yielding for pragmatic reasons, like just putting an end to whatever plague they were going through, Pharaoh expresses an entirely different sentiment after the sixth plague, right? Chapter 9. Pharaoh sent, can we get that slide up? Pharaoh sent and called for Moshe and Aaron and said to them, I have sinned this time. God is righteous and I and my people are wicked. It's hard to believe that Pharaoh is saying that. Something has really changed in his heart. Yeah, he definitely never experienced hail raining down on Egypt amongst thunder and lightning. That doesn't happen in Egypt, if you know that terrain, that territory, the weather there. Let alone the coexistence of fire and ice, which are two completely antithetical elements within the hail. Yeah, this is, in and of itself must have just rocked him to the core. At this point, he must have just been a bundle of frazzled nerves at this point. But in his words, you can see that something deep within him has been shattered, right? He speaks of sin, which is like an objective right and wrong that exists outside himself. He recognizes God, but even more powerfully, he recognized that God is righteous and his people are wicked. He and his people, right? He isn't just talking about the Egyptians alive today at that time. He's now reassessing his ancestors, the people before him. If there is a God and Pharaoh is not him, then everything that his life has been built upon has been a lie. That his entire nation has been built upon falsehood and illusions. And it's hard not to feel bad for him. His whole world is shattering before his eyes. His father and his forefathers are now being exposed not as deities, but as frauds. And this, my friend, isn't just relegated to Pharaoh. This is the story of each and every one of us to some degree or another, because we have all inherited lies, right? Lies that have penetrated their way into the very prism through which we see the world. And so even we, every Jew in our prayers and confessions on the day of awe, right, we say, Aval anachnu va'avotenu chatanu, that we can't stand before Hashem and say that we are righteous because we and our fathers have sinned. That isn't just what Pharaoh said. That's what we say as well. The Torah itself has built this into the process of confession, which we actually learned before on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's in Leviticus, right? In chapter 26, verse 40. They will confess their sins and the sins of their fathers. That's part of confessing, is recognizing how deep that goes. That's why he says, I and my people. The whole story of Egypt has been a lie. What we're seeing happen before our eyes is Pharaoh himself doing tshuva, sincere tshuva. Because when tshuva is sincere, Rabbi Steinsaltz points out, it penetrates to the very root of things. And it encompasses the entire picture. It rewrites the entire story. As the masks are coming off and much of the world is turning not only against Israel, but yes, against the Jewish people, if you feel different, if your love for Israel is growing deeper and stronger, if you're thirsting to cleave to the nation of Israel and to the God of Israel, if you're thirsting to learn authentic Torah from Jews in Judea, then the Land of Israel Fellowship is for you. Hundreds of individuals and families from around the world come together on Zoom every week in what can only be described as a fellowship of love, friendship, of learning and praying and belonging. A fellowship really unlike any other. It's more than just a movement, it's a family. To learn more about the Land of Israel Fellowship, click on www.thelandofisrael.com/fellowship or send an email to fellowship@thelandofisrael.com. Love and blessings from Judea.